I know I'm a little late to the party for doing a decade list, but it being Oscar weekend, I wanted to keep the topic on films. I also recently went through every year's wide releases and chose my favorite, so I figure I'll go through each year of the last decade and talk about a few standout films and my favorite. Without further ado, let's get started. 2019. In my last post about the Oscars, I mentioned my favorite film of last year, but I'll go into more detail and talk about a few others I liked. For starters, I thought Marriage Story was a wonderful film that really let the actors chew into the material. Seriously, every actor brought their A game, and it's no wonder 3 of them received acting nominations. I'll also mention, of course, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's my choice for Best Picture at the Oscars, and though it's not my favorite Tarantino film, I still think he did a really great job. Rocketman was really beautiful. It put Taron Egerton on my radar and has become probably a top 3 musical for me. Now what we're here for. My favorite film of the year is Knives Out. Rian Johnson has really came onto the scene for me in this last decade, and this won't be the last of his films mentioned on this list. I don't want to go into detail about this film and spoil things, but I think it perfectly pays homage to the murder mystery genre of old while bringing some completely new and original ideas. 2018. Of the films I've seen from 2018, a lot were just okay to me, but there's still some that managed to stand above. Firstly, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was incredible. The art style and use of color was beautiful to look at. It's also debatably the best Spider-Man film. Solo, A Star Wars Story, I think gets some undeserved hate. Sure, it wasn't really needed, but what it brings is a fun little adventure in the Star Wars universe that is detached from the rest of the series. Marvel also had a strong outing that year. They brought us Black Panther, a surprise to many, and Avengers Infinity War, which did a great job of tying so many characters and stories together. They both have tremendous villains in common, which I think really helps them stand above the other Marvel films. However, my favorite film of the year was a no-brainer for me. It's Annihilation. Alex Garland is another filmmaker who really comes out of this past decade looking good. This film is great to watch with friends and discuss what everyone got out of it, as well as possible meanings and different understandings of its ambiguous ending. 2017. In 2017, we had a lot of incredibly good movies, or some hugely disappointing ones. For me, it falls more so on the positive side, and makes it tough to choose just a few to talk about here. We'll start by talking about Baby Driver. Despite possibly being Edgar Wright's most successful film, it still seemed to slide under a lot of people's radar, but everyone who watches it seems to really enjoy it. The way it blends the music with the visuals so seamlessly is extremely cool. Secondly, I'll mention my favorite superhero film of the last decade, Logan. It was such a brilliant film in the way it finally showed Wolverine in his most realistic form yet, and was such a beautiful send-off to the character Hugh Jackman has masterfully played for so many years. This year also gave us a few sequels to old cult classics, but the one I want to focus on is Blade Runner 2049. This film is a masterclass in cinematography and production design. You could take a still from pretty much any moment in this film and make it into a poster or wallpaper. Harrison Ford also gave maybe his best performance ever here. Now for my film of the year, and I know it's a controversial pick, but please bear with me. Star Wars: The Last Jedi. I'm a huge fan of Star Wars. It's my favorite franchise, and this film did nothing I was expecting, and I loved it for it. The fact that so many people can talk about this film and have it feel as though they've seen completely different films, I think really speaks to this film's artistry. Rian Johnson was able to take this franchise to such risky places and stand his ground to be an auteur and not just do what is expected and service the story rather than the fans, I think is wonderful. I could probably do an entire blog just about the choices made in this film, and maybe I will at some point. But for now, I'll leave it at just being my favorite film of 2017. 2016. This is another year where I could talk about a lot of films, and any one of the films I talk about could be my choice for film of the year, depending on my mood for that given day. Firstly, a film I feel nobody really talked about is Hail Caesar. It was such a fun film with so many little cameos where the actors just bought into these small little roles. If you haven't watched it, I recommend you do. It's very funny. There's been some excellent sci-fi films in the last decade, and we'll see even more in this list. But next is Arrival. Cool sci-fi films exploring interesting concepts is something I absolutely love, and this film is no exception to that. I'd also like to mention the film that won Oscar for Best Picture, Moonlight. Though I didn't choose it as my favorite of the year, I think it deserves its Oscar. It's a great coming-of-age story that everyone should watch. My pick for film of the year is La La Land, continuing to fill out my top 3 favorite musicals and my musical of the decade. It's such a beautifully shot film, and another that uses color to great effect. 2015. Of the films I watched in 2015, there was a lot I didn't really like, but still enough I liked to make it hard to choose. I'll first mention Star Wars The Force Awakens. It wasn't the most original film, but I think it was exactly what was needed to reintroduce people to the franchise by being a love letter to the originals and do a good job of bringing in the new characters. Mad Max Fury Road might have been better than any of the past Mad Max films. The action and set pieces in that film were tremendous, and the whole experience is a lot of fun. Before I get to my favorite, I also want to mention The Hateful Eight. It was a bit of a slow burn, but I think that tension and distrust in the characters really pays off. And the score by Ennio Morricone is a nice touch. My film of the year, though, must be Ex Machina, another Alex Garland film, and his debut as director. This is yet another small sci-fi film with a great concept and another of his that is great to discuss with friends after viewing. I think Alex Garland has found a tremendous niche with these sci-fi films, and I hope he continues with it. 2014. 2014 was considered as one of the stronger years in film, and for good reason. Gone Girl was a great thriller which David Fincher always handles so masterfully. It was my favorite of Ben Affleck's roles, and it was also great to see Rosamund Pike get into a really good movie, after previously only having seen her in Die Another Day and Doom. The Theory of Everything had an amazing performance by Eddie Redmayne, and he deserved his Best Actor win for it. It also had Felicity Jones, who is criminally underrated. Snowpiercer was my introduction to Bong Joon-ho's work, and what a way to start. If you want to take a wild trip, look into the theory of this film being a sequel to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. In the end, my choice for film of the year is Whiplash, another of Damien Chazelle's movies. Combining him with music seems to be a winning formula for myself, as well as many others. The intimate performances by the two leads, Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons, is a sight to behold. 2013. At this point, there's a huge jump in the number of films I've seen per year, probably just far enough back that a lot of these films have come onto Netflix at some point or have been available to me through other means. I'll first mention Man of Steel. I'm a huge fan of Superman already, and this film made me a huge fan of Henry Cavill on top of it. It's too bad the rest of the DCU couldn't really follow up on what this film started, but I'll always love it, and having a song by Chris Cornell in it is always a win in my books. Now we have two films that were often compared, but I think they're very different. They just share being crime films about taking advantage of a system. The first is Wolf of Wall Street, which many believe is the film that should have won DiCaprio his first Oscar, and I can't really argue against it. The whole film feels like a showcase of his acting abilities, as well as his partying abilities. Then we have American Hustle, which rather than showcasing one actor, is an ensemble piece where nobody really outshined anyone else, and everyone was just solid in their roles. However, amongst all these great films, we have one that stands above for me. And again, one that didn't receive the attention it probably deserved. Inside Llewyn Davis. Oscar Isaac had been in some small roles before, but this felt like his big break. The film is a bit depressing, but has enough light and fun moments to pull you through without feeling entirely drained. 2012. This year was the year I think superhero movies really started to go wild with releases, but one I'll talk about is the conclusion to the Dark Knight trilogy, Dark Knight Rises. It might be a bit slow at the beginning, but everything comes together eventually and it takes off. Tom Hardy's Bane was also incredibly entertaining. Silver Linings Playbook brought out great performances from Jennifer Lawrence and Robert De Niro, but the star here is Bradley Cooper. You could see he had the ability in some of his smaller roles and comedic roles, like in Wedding Crashers and the Hangover trilogy, but this is his coming out party as a star. This year also seen James Bond return to being a huge success, and though I personally love Quantum of Solace, most people didn't, and were very happy to see the homage to the 007 of old with Skyfall. Now for my favorite film of the year, and the third appearance of Rian Johnson, Looper. This film is again a brand new take on sci-fi and time travel films. His approach to doing time travel is so unique and so easy to understand. Just don't bother. Simple as that. 2011. This is the year that has arguably my favorite film of the decade, which we'll get to, but first, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Daniel Craig, other than James Bond, has not had luck with franchises. First, The Golden Compass was doomed to fail by the studios, then The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo was probably released a little too early for audiences to be ready for a big R-rated series. This is another great thriller done by David Fincher, and again, he always seems to nail them. Next is another Ryan Gosling film, Drive. He's had a great decade, and there are even other films I could have mentioned on this list that just didn't fit in. But this film is a fantastic action thriller with one of the small roles by Oscar Isaac I had previously mentioned. Next we had Moneyball, which not only is a great sports film, it even got me thinking differently outside the film. After watching this, I started paying more attention to analytics in sports. Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill also give great performances here, which they both received Oscar nominations for. Now my film of the decade, arguably, Midnight in Paris. I know Woody Allen gets a lot of hate, but his films are consistently well made, and I'd say this is his best. This is another one that affected me outside of the film. Its portrayal of classic literary icons got me to reevaluate some of the classics I read in school. Casting here was also spot on, and Owen Wilson turns in a great performance, which makes me wish he would take more roles like this one. 2010. Finally on to the last year of the decade, 2010. For starters, we have another David Fincher film, but this time not a thriller, The Social Network. This character study is about one of the world's strangest people, Mark Zuckerberg. The cast consists of two people I don't normally enjoy, but Jesse Eisenberg and Andrew Garfield transcend my hang-ups and give very believable performances, becoming the characters. We also got Easy A, an underrated coming-of-age film that seems to have been lost to the times in only 10 years. Still a lot of fun though, with some surprising performances. Choosing between Inception and what I ended up choosing as my favorite was not easy, and Inception deserves all the praise. It's another well-crafted sci-fi film with a cool concept. The tremendous ensemble cast also helps. My last favorite of the decade is none other than Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. This film may be the most stylish I've ever seen. It's a great adaptation of the comics, and it feels ripped right from the pages. Also, Michael Cera was the perfect choice for the somehow both awkward and cool Canadian, Scott Pilgrim. What a great decade for film, which could be said for any decade with film, but it truly was. This period in my life started with my last years of high school and went through my college years, so I feel that my choices are likely a good reflection of where I was at through the years. I can't wait to see what comes in the next decade, and if my thoughts on these films will have changed drastically. I'm also curious what everyone else's favorite films of the last decade were. And if you have any questions or just want to discuss some of my picks, please do in the comments below. Thank you all for watching or listening or reading.